Just want to take this opportunity to welcome everybody once again to the Taking Care of Disability business webinars hosted by First Peoples Disability Network. And as always, I want to start by acknowledging that wherever we're zooming in from, that we're all on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. I want to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and any other Aboriginal people that are on this webinar this afternoon. So just a brief intro on what we're going to be covering today, guys, is we have Kelly, Cox and Samantha Connor, and they will be talking to their experience with group homes. So what they're going to be talking about is the best option, what people need to stay safe and how people can be supported to live in the way they want. Kelly Cox lives in Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales and has extensive knowledge of the NDIS and how to navigate complicated systems, which don't work for all people. Samantha Connor lives in Ballardong country in WA. Like Kelly, she is passionate about disability rights and activism and works in the area of prevention of violence against disabled people. Both women are disabled, and this is an informal conversation with opportunities for participants to ask questions around tricky issues for disabled people in congregate settings. So thank you, Kelly and Samantha, for taking the time to share your knowledge and expertise in the area of group homes with everybody this afternoon. And without much further ado, I'll hand it over to both of you lovely ladies. Thanks.
Thanks, Terry. So Kelly is driving our session today. So bear with us if we get things wrong, because we're going to flick through things. But this is just an introduction to who we are. As Tori said, I live on Ballardong country in Western Australia in the Wheatbelt on stolen land. I'm also a parent of 6 children who are adults, and I work in the area of prevention of violence against disabled people and more generally disability rights and the intersect of policy. And Kelly.
Yeah, so I'm Kelly, as said. I live and work on Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales. It's a tough gig, beautiful Ballina and surrounding areas. I, like Sam, well, probably not like Sam, but do some advocacy and activism, and I also work in the NDIS space as a support coordinator. So yeah, have that lived experience of disability myself, and also of navigating the NDIS and the service sector and all of the issues that arise from that. Yeah, that's me.
I'm laughing because Kelly said not like Sam, but quite often it's Kelly is sometimes blunter than I am. So it's an interesting thing. It's like, who is good cop today? So our next slide is about group homes and whether they're the best option. We're going to be talking about what people need to stay safe, as Tori said, how people should be supported to live in the way that they want. And so quite often we get, we depersonalise disability a little bit, and we other people and think about people as clients or consumers, and we don't think about them in a context of people that we know. It's a lot easier for us as disabled people and parents, and for people who, know other people and who they are as humans, to think about what things might look for. So we'd really like you to think about somebody that you know that this applies to. It might be your child, a family member, it might be somebody that you know that you've worked with, but also think about yourself. So think about the way that everything that we are talking about today might apply to you if you lived in a group home. It can be hard if you're not a person who generally would be placed in a congregate environment. So over to you, Cal.
Yeah, so the first thing that we'll talk about is, what does the UN Convention on the Rights of People with a Disability say? So I'll just go to the next screen. So it says that we have the right to choose who we live with and where we live. So to directly quote the convention, it says persons with a disability have the opportunity to choose their place of residence, where, and I'm just sorry, my screen is being hidden, where and with whom they live on an equal basis with others and are not obliged to live in a particular living arrangement. So, as you can see on the screen, this means that we have the right to choose where we live, like we have the right to choose who we live with, and we do not have to live in a place if we do not want to. That's what the convention says, and as many of us know, that doesn't always happen in real life, and that's one of the things that we need to work on and change.
Yeah.
So we should not be shut out or shut in from the world, from our community, our homes, all of those things. So persons with a disability have access to a range of in-home, residential and other community support services, including personal assistance necessary to support living and inclusion in the community and to prevent isolation or segregation from the community. So that means that we have the right to get the support we need, and that we have the right to get support to live outside of residential settings, and that we have the right to get enough support to be in the community with other people. And is it still me, Sam? I've actually lost my notes on which slide I'm doing.
That's okay. You stole my slide then, Kelly, so I'm going to steal yours. So I'll steal the next two. So this one is the last point, which is that we should have the same community opportunities as other people. So this talks about community services and facilities for the general population are available on an equal basis to us and should be responsive to our needs. People quite often think that that means going to the park or the museum or getting pushed around Westfield, you know, that kind of thing. But actually it means we need equal access to all of the services that we have in the community. So that means that we should have access to services like domestic violence services in an equal way, police services, housing services, tenancy services, and the services and facilities need to actually accommodate our needs by, you know, by law in the convention. That doesn't always happen for us, as people know. If we're not given choices about where we live, you know, this Article 19 in the convention says that we should be given a choice. You know, do you want to live in the place that you've lived for the last 20 years is not really a choice if you don't have any other choices around accessible housing or, you know, if you don't like the people who you're living with, that kind of thing. And so the next slide is about from the Disability Royal Commission issues paper. If you flick over, Kelly. And it's just a few quotes in there. The reason they've put this in is because there's some assumptions that have been made around group homes and institutional living, that it's perfectly okay for us, you know, to have to live in a group home environment. And that's not the case. So when we come to the NDIS, for example, I have a lot of physically disabled friends who are living in their houses, you know, just as regular people, who have been directly challenged by NDIS about, you know, have you thought about getting somebody else to come in and live with you and share your house? So there's a whole bunch of assumptions about the way that we should live and that we should be given the support that we need to live in a usual home. The CRPD committee actually defined living independently in the community as living in settings which are outside residential institutions of all kinds, and that includes group homes. Group homes refers to accommodation where services and supports, both within the home and community, are provided to 4 to 6 long-term residents with disabilities. So there is an actual definition around this. Group homes may include 24-hour on-site staff support, and it's defined in the NDIS rules as well in 2016 as houses that are enrolled or will be enrolled to house 4 to 5 long-term residents, typically classified as building class 1 or 3 under the Building Code of Australia. So there's also a bit of an issue with geography. If you live in Queensland, for example, the definition traditionally of group homes has been more than 4 to 6 people. It's been, you know, sometimes 10 people, and there's still a lot of these places that are, I think people tend to call them mini institutions, but they also call them group homes. So it's good that we're getting some definitions, and the Royal Commission staff are looking very firmly at what happens to people when they live in institutionalised settings. And so if we flick on to the next page, this is also me, is a picture of a really odd looking duck. It's still a duck. It's a duck that lives in Spain. And there's a famous quote, which is around, you know, ducks, which says, if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. It's by a guy named James Whitcomb Riley. So is a group home an institution? Well, there's the thing, you know, what does an institution look like? And so I'll flick you over to Kelly to tell you what that might look like.
Yeah, so an institution could look like a lot of things, but we might give an example of what happens in the UK for supported independent living over there, and the principles of the things that people living in those supported independent living settings, what the providers have to meet in terms of principles, and that might give us an idea of what's, you know, happening or not happening in Australia. So people get to choose who they live with. They get to choose where they live. They might have their own home. They get to choose how they are supported and who supports them. And that might not be the same people as are supporting other people who they live with. They get good support, good quality, and from the people that they choose. They get to choose who their friends are and what relationships they have, and, you know, whether they have visitors or when they go out. They get to choose how to be healthy and safe and what's important to them and what they consider to be safe or not safe or unhealthy. You know, lots of people have different, I guess, definitions of what's safety. If I have a salad sandwich, I'm being pretty healthy, whereas other people I know would go, no, you know, that's bread and it's really unhealthy. So there's lots of, you know, different interpretations of that type of stuff. People, you know, get to choose how they take part in the community and what parts of the community they want to be involved in. And they have the same rights and responsibilities as other citizens. And they get help to make changes in their life. So they're not stuck, you know, because they agreed to something perhaps when they moved in somewhere with some people, that they don't have to live by that forever. They have a right to change their mind and make changes and do other things.
And I think there's also a whole world of stuff in those two words, I choose, because when you take into consideration that we also have substitute decision making, where people have guardians and people who, you know, nominees and people who are sort of substitute decision makers, I guess sometimes that's even the service provider. You know, how are people's will and preference being upheld? Do they have access to supported decision making, is the term that the providers use? Do they have access to the right information? So if I'm going to make a choice about what to have for breakfast, it shouldn't be, what do you want for breakfast? Is it going to be Wheaties or cornflakes? Like, that's not actually a choice. So what a choice is, you know, what do you want for breakfast? Open-ended question. It also means, do you want to stay in bed and get Uber Eats? It means, do you want to go down with friends to Dome? Do you want to, you know, not eat anything at all because you're not hungry today? Do you just want to sleep till noon? You know, so there's a whole bunch of things around what that looks like. Also, you know, whether people's communication rights are upheld and whether they're being supported to communicate their choices. It shouldn't just be one thing or the other. So our next slide, I'm going to pick on Kelly at this point because I know that her lounge room is generally pretty tidy, but there's a slide which says, what does an institution look like? And so, Kelly, what's in your, I assume you're in your lounge room. What's in your lounge room right now in front of you?
I am in my lounge room. It's not very tidy at the moment because I have been in isolation since, you know, February, March. So, but if I look around the room, I've got a bag of Skittles on the coffee table where I've been snacking as I watch Netflix and whatnot. I've got, you know, phones and creams and just piles of stuff. My little dog is on the floor next to me, and I'm terrified that she's going to start barking at any minute, and I won't be able to stop her. Yeah, I've got some pot plants, and I've got a pile of old clothes that I've got to take to the op shop, and lamps. I've actually got I found it the other day. It's my childhood teddy bear. His name is Lino. So yeah, all kinds of things. Blankets, yeah, stuff I haven't cleaned up. Yeah, all types of bits and pieces that I put them down and I left them there, and I won't pick them up until I am ready to.
And so you have a lot of support. I know that we're in a pandemic and you've had one person living with you, but generally you have a team of people. Like, do you have laminated signs on your wall about, remembering to do the dishes, or do you have, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so no laminated signs here. No laminated signs, no checklists, no plan on what to do if I'm in a bad mood that day. Just stay away from me. I don't have, a fire safety plan and a fire extinguisher on the wall, and my house is basically like anybody else's house, including just piles of junk that are piling up.
Okay, so then you're also somewhat dictated by, right? Because in terms of when people come in, you've only got X amount of time for support. So if you tell someone to come in and give you a hand with showering, then that means can you tell that person you don't feel like having a shower today? Like,
yeah,
what is it? Okay,
yep.
So that's
I can decide not to have a shower, or what time do I want to have a shower, when they first get here or at the end of it, whether I want to eat and what I want to eat. If we don't have, if say I decided I wanted to have scrambled eggs for breakfast and we had no eggs, I've got the right to tell that person to, go to the shop and buy me some eggs. And I can make all of those choices within that time that I want, that may not be the case for people who live in an institutional setting.
Yeah. And so I'm not going to tell you about the room that I'm in because there's a floor robe right now, so on my bed, but probably doesn't look anything like any room that I've seen in a group home. It's quite different when people are making and cleaning up their own messes to, what things look like, I guess. And there's also a thing of regimes and regimented settings where people don't have choices about what happens for them. So, for example, there's the Quadriplegic Centre of WA. I spent some time trying to understand what that setting looked like. It's a C-class hospital. Lots of people have been there long term. And I remember early on someone said, I'm really grateful to get a hot cup of coffee. And I didn't understand then that the temperature of the water is regulated to warm for everyone because of the risk of someone spilling it on themselves, and they're given, the coffee's given to them in plastic mugs with lids, and you don't have any choices around that. So those sort of things are really difficult to sort of pick up. That's what an institution looks like. It's institutionalised practices. The picture on the screen is of Anne-Marie Smith, who is a woman in Adelaide who died about a month ago. As people in the disability sector probably are aware. Anne-Marie lived in an ordinary house on an ordinary street, and she died there. She died as a result of abhorrent neglect. She had 6 hours a day of support from a disability service provider. Obviously, we can't talk about it much because there's an active police investigation going on, but lots of us have been doing a lot of work around this. But the neighbours said that, they hadn't seen Anne-Marie outside of her house for about 10 years. So when you're living in a house with nearly $1 million with a really manicured front lawn, and you're not able to get to your bed or to your wheelchair or to leave the house, and you're using the cane chair that you've been placed in as a toilet, really big issues around there. And absolutely that home can also look like an institution. So Kelly, I'll flick over to you.
just will try and get the computer to cooperate. Yeah, so I think like Sam said that, this is me trying to get through my notes and figure out what I'm up to. Yeah, that a house like Anne-Marie's could be, you know, from the outside look like any other house, but because of the way that, you know, Anne-Marie, well, she wasn't getting support and she wasn't connected to her community, it would seem, that wasn't a very good situation that had devastating outcome for her. Sorry, Sam, I've lost my train of thought.
No, that's okay. This is what happens when we have the two people working together and one person doing one thing and one person doing another. So I've got a picture of. Oh, that's right. I've got a picture of a lipstick on a pig, which, you know, quite often we say that it's not an institution because it's not an institution because it's an ordinary house and an ordinary street, and that's what a group home is. And so we call that putting lipstick on a pig and making it sound prettier than it is. If it's an institution, it's an institution, you know. But I'm just wondering, Kelly, like just in terms of the work that you do, I know you work for Coroner and Co, a provider, you arrange people's support with them, and you know, have you got an example that you could talk about where somebody might have had their rights kind of breached or wouldn't be able to do things in the usual way because they live in a group home or institutionalized environment?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of examples I see in the sector, and just recently even in a service provider online group, somebody made a post and said, oh, you know, I support this young woman, and she's, you know, she's got a boyfriend, and, you know, she likes to give him money, and she'll do that to the point where she might be able to afford food or things for herself. What should I do? And it really was astounding to watch the amount of people that said in response to that to you know, explore a guardianship application for her and to remove her rights because she wanted to make choices to, you know, support her boyfriend over, you know, meeting her own needs, or that. And I see this a lot in the sector where people immediately go to removal of rights. And I think that if we looked at a situation for perhaps a non-disabled woman who was making certain decisions that we didn't agree with, or that we thought that, you know, they might be being abused or whatever, we'd probably be more likely to do a referral to a domestic violence service or somewhere where they could access some support to know, you know, that there is help out there, or to, you know, think through what they're doing. They might choose to still make those decisions and live with the consequence of, you know, I'm hungry, or I can't afford the Skittles, or whatever that might be. But I think there's this real tendency in the disability sector that we automatically go to something bad is happening for you, or something that we consider to be bad is happening for you. And in response to that, we're going to take steps that, you know, are more punitive and that add layers to the situation that perhaps isn't already ideal. And I think as a sector, we really need to work on not doing that anymore, and not automatically taking people's rights away as a first step, or any step ever, and making sure that people can make all the decisions that they want, including if they're not good or it's not the decision that we'd make. And I think that those scenarios certainly play out more often in group homes or institutional settings where people, you know, are being forced to live, you know, into somebody else's roster. You know, there's no staff at this point in time, so sorry, can you not need this extra support at this time, or don't make that decision, or you've not saved any money for food. And people want to take people's rights away really quickly, and particularly in those institutional settings.
Absolutely. So yeah, that idea that institutions are created from institutional practices rather than from, you know, bricks and mortar, I think is a really important thing. And my pet hate is when there's some really chunky support workers saying, no, you can't have McDonald's because you'll put on weight. So this is my pet hate, that we really other people and treat people differently. So this slide's about, this was a really striking fact that jumped out at me around COVID. We can't have a Zoom meeting without talking about the pandemic, of course, at the moment. That 43% of the people in the USA who have died from COVID-19 live in nursing homes and institutional settings. So that was 43,000 people. And so a lot of people are saying, well, that's because of their age. But actually it's not, because it's not comparable to the amount of people who are older people living in community. So when you sort of pull that stuff apart, it's been a really interesting time. Some of the nursing homes said that, look, we're going to have a thing called Hospital in the Home program. But that, of course, meant that you're not necessarily going to have access to a ventilator if you're in a nursing home or institutional setting. It meant that disabled people are treated differently, including younger people who are living in nursing homes. So there's been a really striking thing, I think, around institutional settings. You know, for people in group homes, we've heard really terrible stories during the pandemic about people being isolated further, obviously, and everybody is isolated at the moment. This is a little bit of a taste for the non-disabled people about what our lives look like quite often, you know. There's really been some big issues which I think are going to come out later. People have been told that if they leave their home, then they won't be able to return their group home. They've been told that their family members can't come to their group home and visit them. And they've been deprived of support because of mandatory rules that have been put in place, you know, in the same kind of ways that we put them in place at Bunnings. You know, everybody has to stay 1.5 metres apart from each other. How do you do that when you've got 4 residents living in a house and, you know, you're all sharing a kitchen or something? It's just not a workable thing. So most people don't live in a model. You know, most people live in a house on a street, or they live with family, or they live in usual ways. A group home isn't necessarily a usual way to live. People do live in congregate settings in the real world when, you know, if you're a student, you might have, I don't know, advertised on Gumtree or something to get some other people come and live with you, and you might rent out some rooms, but it looks very, very different than when your life is run by other people. And I think it's a really good opportunity for us to be thinking about what institutional settings look like, and to think about the concept that the Ruby Princess was actually a giant floating institution, that, you know, that it was a difficult place to manage because you had other people who were responsible for the care of others. And it's a pretty good analogy for the types of issues that we experience and the types of danger that disabled people are in sometimes when they live in institutional settings. So I'll flick over to you, Cal.
Yep. I don't know if my slides are in order. So I think, yeah, on what Sam was saying, and then, and if we think about group homes and things like that, you know, some of the questions on the screen, you know, and things to think about of whether, you know, can a disabled person move out of their group home if they are experiencing client capture. So, for example, they've got one service provider who's providing their support coordination, you know, they're the SIL provider, they're the SDA provider, you know, they might even be providing the therapy supports as well. So how does somebody get out of that situation if the same organisation is providing every single support and there's no independent person who might be able to step in and provide some other support and options? And does the disabled person have the same opportunities as others to be able to understand choices and to communicate them? You know, and are they given those choices in the first place? And that might be from something like Sam was saying earlier around, you know, what do you have for breakfast? Being asked what do you want from breakfast is very different from somebody saying, do you want toast or cereal, or do you want cornflakes or muesli? that's not really a choice. That's not a choice in the same way most people, you know, have choices. It's from a limited set list that somebody else has decided on. Does a disabled person have the same opportunities as other people to participate in the community if they are living in a group home? So, you know, that might relate to things like relationships and, you know, whether or not you can be supported to go to the pub on a Friday night and, you know, pick someone up and bring them home. You know, have you got a single bed or a double bed? Are you allowed to bring people home late at night? Are you even allowed to go out late at night? Do you have a key to get back in, or are you reliant on somebody letting you in? And it might be as small as, you know, other things about just being able to go to the art group or being able to find the things that you're interested in and to become a part of it and to have support to do that, you know, without having to agree to do the same thing that the 5 other people that you live with might have to do, because that's something that happens a lot as well, where it's like, no, we're all going to hop on the bus and we're all going to go and do this one activity, whether everybody likes it or not.
And I think that Tanya, there's just been a few comments in the chat that Tanya said, you know, for example, to have family over is a thing. I went out yesterday. This is a big thing for disabled people at the moment. I went out and, you know, we're planning at the moment a baby shower a week before my eldest child gives birth, because that's the way our family does things at the last minute. But we've got, you know, there's 6 kids in my family who are adult children. And so when you have family over, that's 20 people, you know, so having family over when you have 20 people in your group home for something like a baby shower, could you hold a baby shower? You know, could you have a birthday party? Could you do those sorts of things at the same time? Well, possibly not. What about having kids? What does that look like if you live in a group home and you want to have children? You know, that's probably not achievable. There's been another comment from Fiona about, you know, loving your point, Kelly, about people's punitive responses to human rights breaches that just exacerbate things further. It's the same as what CPS do to parents with an intellectual disability. They take the children away and force them to continually jump through hoops to prove capacity rather than providing support. And I know that Kel's talking about the same thing for Aboriginal women as well. About the question 2, which is around having the same opportunities to understand choices and communicate them and being given those choices. Bernadette says that that's why we have a need for greater independent advocacy. And yes, 1,000% yes, you know, that we shouldn't have waiting lists, you know, for things that are urgent. We should have, you know, we shouldn't have barriers in the way to independent advocacy and individualised advocacy. There's a lot of people who don't even know the word advocacy. It's not safe for them. It's not accessible for them. Really, it's a city thing. I live in the country. A lot of people don't know that term or that concept. And so, you know, just getting help to do things when you run into problems, or having someone walk alongside of you to be able to get your rights upheld, is a concept a lot of people don't know. So the next one is, what did you do on the weekend? And, you know, and what would the person that you're thinking about have to do in order to do the things that you did? If any of you want to chip in on chat, that would be good. But Kelly, what did you do on the weekend? Because you're isolating, right?
I am isolating. So I just changed that screen. So I was home on the weekend, and I didn't go anywhere. But if I had have wanted to go, you know, we've got the photo of Bunnings. If I had have wanted to go to Bunnings, I would experience, you know, a few barriers and a few extra steps compared to, you know, perhaps, you know, non-disabled people. In that I'd have to organise support, and it would have to, you know, be somebody who can operate the hoist and drive my very large van. But I have that ability and that privilege that I can organise that, and I could probably do it, you know, not sporadically, but I could do it on relatively short notice in most cases, where I think for people in a group home, you know, waking up on a Saturday or Sunday morning and saying, I'm going to go to Bunnings and, you know, have a sausage sizzle and buy a new pot plant is perhaps not something that's easily done or even possible at all.
Absolutely. And you've also got this stuff around, you know, accessing your money sometimes, you know, whether people are going to let you actually buy something. I was given the example by a support worker in a whistleblowing account not too long ago, that she really, her thing was buying fresh flowers every week, and the support worker said, no, look, you can buy plastic flowers because they'll last longer. And I was just heartbroken because, you know, when there's a thing that someone does, you know, this person was denied their right just to buy a bunch of flowers every week, which is just I don't know, just like buying some block of chocolate or whatever. Tanya's just saying she can't see the chat. That's okay, Tanya, I'll read out the answers here. So there's a little button that, I'll do some Zoom training here, people. There's a button that says send to, and you can send it to all panelists or you can send it to all people. So it's right down the bottom where it says send to, just above the chat box. Kylie said, hello from, tell me if I get this wrong, Kelly, it's Dharawal land? Dharawal.
I think Kylie could let us know if you haven't pronounced that right.
Thank you. I have a new puppy. Oh, condolences. But how many people living in group homes get that opportunity? Absolutely. There's a whole bunch of things to think about when you have a pet. People in group homes generally don't have a pet. There's, even when you're living in your own home, there's some rules that some agencies have in place to say that they won't empty the kitty litter, you know, so that's the kind of issue that people quite often face. So Tanya, did you get that sorted? Yes, excellent. My Zoom training is done. I know that, so I know Tanya from, also lives in my old hometown. So Tanya is from the Bogan suburb next to the Bogan suburb that I grew up in. And so we call each other by our postcodes, as you do in the Bronx. Sorry, Tanya, if I'm throwing you under the bus with your secrets here. So, but, you know, so I know that Tanya's family is also, you know, a family. We don't have plans around life generally for most people. For most non-disabled people, they don't have a life plan. They don't.
Do you mean that they don't have to set goals every 12 months, Sam?
Oh, you mean the goals at the end? The goals that the NDIS now want us to measure and so that we can have outcomes. No, I've heard that the non-disabled do not do that thing. So, you know, so planning ahead, I'm autistic and have ADHD. I do not plan anything because ADHD, this is the thing. Tanya's just said 6107 represent. So I was 6108. So, you know, we don't tend to plan things around what our lives are going to look at, and the lives of disabled people are so hugely planned. This screenshot is called Being Safe, and this is actually, you know, a guy who's lying face down, wrapped in bubble wrap, and is unable to move because he's so tied up in bubble wrap. And I think that's quite often what our lives look like, because when we're talking about making plans, people quite often risk assess us, you know, as though we're the danger, not the thing on the outside. So, you know, those goals are tied into the plans and how they're operationalised. Quite often we're never going to get to Bunnings or do that thing in the first place. So, if you flick on to the next one, there's a quote from the National Disability Strategy, and it says that people with disability are more vulnerable to violence, exploitation and to neglect than others in the community. People with disability face worse in institutional contexts where violence may be more common. And so these are not, this isn't conjecture. This isn't, we actually know about safety, and we know about how safe we are in the community and how safe we are in institutional settings. There's a really startling statistic in Australia right now that the average life expectancy for a person with an intellectual disability from a preventable death is 54 years of age. that's appalling, you know. So that's an enormous gap. It's something like 26 or 27 years between us and the non-disabled community. If you're autistic, you're twice as likely to die from accidental injury. If you're a disabled woman who has an intellectual disability, your life expectancy is even lower. It's 49 years of age. And these are shameful statistics. They're really prevalent. That idea of preventable deaths means people who die from choking, people who die from failure of care, from hospital-acquired pneumonia, those sorts of things. And if we're talking about preventable deaths, we're talking about people not getting dental care and then choking because they don't have teeth to chew their food. And we're talking about people not being given the time to swallow their food. We're talking about people not being supervised enough so that they don't go and access poisons, those sorts of things. So we do have a problem in congregate settings, and that includes group homes. So over to you, Kel.
So this slide is titled, Why is the Disability Royal Commission, so DRC, looking at group homes right now? So I'm just going to So the Disability Royal Commission issue paper states that over time, group homes have become a common form of accommodation for people with a disability who were moved out of institutional care. The group home model was intended to provide people with a disability with more independence and meaningful life choices, and that many people think that group homes do not achieve these benefits. Disability advocates point to research highlighting that segregated environments, such as group homes, increase the risk of violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation for people with disability. And some of the reasons for that, are the things that we've talked about already, and it's also about being isolated and perhaps segregated from your community, not having the ability to make those choices and to join in with the parts of community that you would choose to join in, and perhaps that nobody is aware of that. We for lots of people, and Sam will probably talk about developmental safeguards much better than I will, but as a disabled woman, who works, who knows my neighbours, who is from a small town where people know me, people notice when I don't show up. If I don't go to work, I'll get a phone call and go, where are you? Are you okay? Or if I don't go to the places that I usually go, people will notice that, and that provides a level of safety to me, because somebody will look for me and know if I'm not there, and that doesn't always happen for people in group homes. And you might want to expand on that a little bit more, Sam.
Yeah, for sure. And so, look, there's that idea that, I'll talk about that in the context of developmental safeguards, but just when people notice that we don't show up, I collect stories of disabled people who have died as a result of violence, abuse and neglect. And quite often people will have heard about the story about Willow Dunn, the toddler with Down syndrome who died a couple of weeks ago. People didn't know that there was another child who lived in the house. So this is a thing where we're isolated, segregated, kept away from people. People don't actually know that where we are and that when we're missing. And so the next slide is kind of is just a one-liner about that, but it's his choice to live in a group home. And so every time you hear that, as people who are good advocates, please challenge that. Say, how is those person's how's that person's communication upheld? What kind of other choices has that person had? How were those choices presented to them? Are they the actual decision maker? Have they got all the information that they need to make decisions that are supported in a supported decision-making context? So it's really important that we ask those questions. Every single time you hear that thing, it's your choice. You need to know it's not a choice if you've only done one thing in your life and you've never tried another thing. You don't know what those other things look like. You need to have the same opportunities to try the things. So, yeah, the next one, Kel.
So what keeps us safe? So some of the things that we've already talked about being present in our communities, where people will know if we're missing or we're hurt, or if, you know, if there's something wrong. And that's including perhaps, you know, being upset or sad or angry one day, and that being acknowledged as a normal human emotion. And it might not mean that you need, you know, a lot of therapy or some plan put in place, or that we're connected to people and we've got real connections with people, and people notice when something perhaps isn't right. And that leads into also being valued and being cared about. And, you know, that just the fact that somebody exists and that they are a human being should be enough to value people. You know, there should not be this thing that you have to be a particular type of person who works or does something for you to be seen as valuable. Everybody holds value, and I think we need to, you know, think about that and remember that, and make sure that other people are aware of that and live a life like that as well. Which, you know, is also about being treated as other people would like to be treated. So I think, you know, if you work in the sector, you know, as a provider or as an advocate, or, you know, if no matter who you are, if you see somebody being treated in a way that perhaps you wouldn't like to be treated, or if perhaps, you know, in your work you're having to do something where you go, I would hate it if this was me, that you take a step back and reflect on that and maybe change tact and look at another way of helping somebody through a situation. Or
And there's just a couple of comments on the chat. Erica said, everyone that you meet's asked, what job do you do? And that's so true. You know, that you go to the bar, right? You know, there's a thing of like, what do you do for a crust? So that's a question, you know. It's a shameful thing to say that you're unemployed, right? You don't get asked that if you're a disabled person necessarily.
No, and I think, Sam, and I can't remember where I was reading it now, so I can't credit the person, but I was reading something the other day that even, you know, from childhood, we get asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? Which, you know, places this extra importance on having the right job, or when really, you know, we probably should be asking people, who do you want to be when you grow up? What type of person do you want to be? And I think that small change in language from childhood probably have a whole bunch of cultural changes around how we view people, and how, you know, what we value from other people. You know, what kind of job you do is so not important compared to what type of person you are and how you treat other people.
And I'll just add, Daryl's commented that he's from Yorta Yorta country, has made a written complaint to an RAP medical clinic for breaching a community member's medical privacy, received no response at all despite following up with emails and telephone calls, escalated the issue to a disability ombudsman in Victoria, who ended up saying that because he couldn't provide informed consent and didn't have a legal guardian, they couldn't act on the issue. And Daryl's going to take the matter to the current Royal Commission. Thank you so much for doing that, because I think that's really important.
I think, and then when we've got that question down the bottom about what does safety look like for Aboriginal people, and I think people, you know, should be reflecting on that.
Tell us about the funeral that you went to recently.
Yeah, so I went to a friend's funeral a little while ago, and you know, and it was a big funeral, and lots of people got up and spoke. And one of the things that stood out to me through that was that there was a lot of people who were talking about these moments that they had with this person that you know, they were special moments to them, where they felt that they, you know, were connecting with that person, and they'll miss those times. But for me, what I was hearing was story after story about this person who was a wheelchair user, who would be in people's front yards and would be yelling out because they couldn't access the front door because there was lack of access. And then they were asking for support and assistance, you know, personal care in some instances. Can you help me, you know, do this, or, you know, can you make me a cup of tea, or can you, you know, do something for me? So while for those people who, you know, who are reminiscing on those moments that they had with that person, for me, it was just really alarming that despite having an NDIS plan, this person, you know, had no support. They're not the reasons that you should be in somebody's front yard, you know, to visit, that you're not just going to visit your neighbours or your family or anything like that to catch up. It's because you actually need something that should be provided in your home. So yeah, it was a really startling moment for me to hear these stories, and to perhaps be hearing something as a wheelchair user, be hearing, I think what I was hearing was probably different to what people were trying to convey and what other people were perhaps hearing from those stories. And not to detract from that, you know, they were moments for those people where there was genuine connection. It shouldn't have had to have been like that, and he shouldn't have been yelling from people's front yard for help every day.
So yeah, absolutely. And so I'll go through the next 2 slides reasonably quickly. Just Kelly's just going to talk about intersectionality after that, but we just want to leave a few 5 minutes at the end just for questions from people. But people who are already in the sector will be aware that when we're talking about safety for disabled people, we use code in disability language. So we talk about developmental safeguards, preventative safeguards, corrective safeguards. So developmental safeguards, as we talked about before, is when people notice that we're missing or hurt. So for example, for Anne-Marie, people will know that there's something wrong. That might also extend in a group home context to having the right, you know, not having a casualised support worker, you know, so you've got millions of support workers in your life who don't know, if you don't use spoken language, what your behaviour means, you know. There's a woman named Ms. Hookie, and I've linked to the resources at the end, and hopefully we can get FDPN to put the slideshow up as well, just to link in with those things. So the coroner's report is in there, and it talks about this woman who died in New South Wales in a group home. Another woman died in almost exactly the same circumstances. And if you look at the stories of those people, she was a young Aboriginal person, didn't have family contact, in state care. There's a whole bunch of those safeguards where you can look at where those things were missing for that person and how that went wrong and how she ended up, you know, really sadly passing away. Preventative safeguards are those things like, you know, police checks and making sure that people are not terrible people, and you know, but as we know, they don't always work because some countries don't have bilateral agreements around, you know, if someone comes from Ireland, then, you know, we don't have a thing in place to know that that person's not a rapist when they come over. We don't have, you have to be caught too, you know, and then that person needs to, who's the victim of the previous crime, needs to be able to go to court to give evidence against that person so that you can get a police check, those sorts of things. There's a lot of things with preventative safeguards that really don't work. And that sometimes includes, you know, mechanisms like the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. People are asking questions right now in the context of Anne-Marie's death about, you know, how that could have worked better. And corrective safeguards are things like when, you know, after the event, you know, do people have access to actually make a complaint? Do they, can they get counselling? What happens after somebody has been abused? Can they just call the cops? Can the cops turn up and not have to speak to your perpetrator if, you know, if it's a person who's a support worker who's abused you in a group home? So that's what those safeguards look like. And the next slide just gives you a picture, which is something called the Swiss cheese model of accident causation, I think, but it's a bit useful if you flick onto that one, Kel. It shows where things go wrong. If you think of all of those preventative safeguards and you think of things like a police check and you think of things like a bunch of different support workers working unassisted with you and not having enough choices and not having your communication upheld as being safeguards, what happens is when those holes line up for people, when you've got enough flaws in those layers, there's no such thing as a piece of Swiss cheese that doesn't have holes in it, you know? So if there is, I don't know about it. So there's no bulletproof thing what actually keeps us safe is having a mixture of all of those things that actually keeps us safe. And so, Kel, over to you.
So intersectionality. So when it goes wrong for Aboriginal people, and I guess exploring a little some of the reasons about why that might happen, or what some of the barriers might be in even getting to the point where somebody might make a submission to a Royal Commission or be asking for support, or to even know that support exists. So the things listed on the screen are, you know, racial bias in people. And, you know, I think as we hopefully are all aware that sometimes people don't know or acknowledge that they hold that. You know, systemic racism, so the way, you know, systems are built that exclude Aboriginal people and their cultural needs just simply by design. White assumptions. So, you know, perhaps not understanding culture, or thinking that you understand culture because you've done, you know, a half-day workshop, and then assuming that, you know, there's all this stuff that you know about when perhaps you don't. And then the trauma and the history of the stolen generation, and the fear of removal of children and distrust. So to give an example, and with permission, I've spoken to this mum this morning. You know, last week I currently am, but particularly last week there's a young Aboriginal girl that I'm currently supporting as part of my work, and we've been trying really hard to get the right amount of, you know, support in her NDIS plan for her. So, you know, as most of us know, that starts becoming a situation of where you just, you know, evidence and more evidence. And so I asked her mum, I said, you know, could you write a letter to the NDIS, you know, to talk about what life is like for you and for your other kids? And it took a lot of support, and it was a really hard thing for her to write, because, you know, there's a risk to Aboriginal people, you know, and there's fear, and, you know, whether it's a real or perceived risk, that if you're an Aboriginal mum who says, I'm not coping, or this is what's happening to my children, or, you know, any number of things that might be, you know, a totally non-controversial thing for, you know, a non-Aboriginal mum to talk about, there's a fear that, you know, there might be a report to Child Protection, or that somebody, you know, will judge you and assume that you're not able to be a good parent, or all of that thing. And that was certainly the experience that that this mum had last week. And, you know, she did an amazing job, and you know, and wrote, you know, a really honest letter about her feelings and about the impact of not having appropriate support has, you know, not on just her but the entire family. But yeah, there's this fear that sits behind that about what if somebody takes this, you know, this one sentence that I've written, and uses that against me. And, you know, and we know that there's a history of things being used against Aboriginal people, again, to take punitive measures and to do all kinds of things. So, you know, we have to be thinking about that as well, that, you know, there are consequences for everything, and we know that. And when there's a history of that, your fear and the thing that you're scared of is actually something that can happen, we can't minimize the impact that can have, and the fear that can, you know, sit behind that. And that there probably are so many things that go unsaid because of that, and that we have to do better and acknowledge that and be aware of that. Absolutely. And then the other thing is, you know, having access to diagnosis, and, you know, to be able to access support from something like the NDIS, which is not meant to be diagnosis based, but that's not, you know, what we're seeing on a practical level. If you live in a remote community, or, you know, somewhere where there's not just access to, you know, medical professionals or the specialists that you need to get that type of thing, you can't even get to the point where you can apply for the NDIS.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and then there's things, you know, having access to country. So, You know, if you're a young Aboriginal person who's a wheelchair user, you might not be able to connect to country in the same way as your peers might. And, you know, sometimes that's not something that's openly talked about. You know, whether somebody can get on country in the same way other people can, or whether they can, you know, join the dance group or those other things. So I think, you know, as a community, we all need to be aware of that and actively thinking about, you know, how do we make sure that, you know, people can stay connected to country and culture, you know, at the same level as everybody else. Yeah, and the access to support, as I said, if you can't even get access to a diagnosis, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to get support.
And Damien told me that it's $8,000 to get a diagnosis in the Kimberley and WA, you know, so for people who don't have access to a diagnosis, you know, quite often you're not able to access it as an adult, even in the prison system. Just acknowledging also that there's, you know, people like us who are, you know, disabled parents of disabled children exist. So quite often we have multiple issues around that. And there's, 9.8 times more likely if you're Aboriginal to have your children removed. If you're, as Fiona was talking about before, if you're a person with an intellectual disability, then there's also huge issues. So that is us, I think. Done.
Yeah, we've got a little video clip if people are interested in spending another couple of minutes watching that and maybe thinking about some questions if they wanted to ask some. So
have we got time, Tori? Did you expect us to be finished like dead on time? Because, you know, we're those women who never are.
Yeah,
it's
I
one
think,
and a half.
you know, if people want to stay on, then by all means, they're welcome to. Yeah, we can continue to go on. Obviously, it's a little past 2 o'clock now, but
yep,
I guess if people need to go, that's fine as well.
Cool. And if you just chuck any other questions in it, you know, any questions in the chat that you might have, and including around Disability Royal Commission, that'd be awesome. And Kel, I'll leave you to navigate the tech.
I am. Oh, have we?
I'm well impressed.
What can people see? Can you see the video screen?
Yeah,
I can see screen. Yeah. So this is a video by a guy named Peter Lady, and he wrote an amusing song about group homes. But yeah, have a listen and have a think about what it means. And so you're probably going to press the play button on the screen as well. Yep, that's the guy.
Is that working?
Yeah.
It is. Awesome, well done. Thanks, Tori, and thanks, Kelly.
That's all right. I just probably would mention to people that Open Future Learning, where that video came from, it's well worth looking at some of their other content and bits and pieces.
Great.
Yeah, I thought that video was hilarious. Thanks for sharing that. And also thank you both for coming on today and giving the time. I think a lot of the points you raised, are very valid, and also I think challenge, unconscious bias for people in the industry and around the industry. Particularly, when you made the point of what's healthy look like to somebody. Kelly, I thought that was a good analogy. Because as people that are going in to support people, that's exactly that. They've got to support their worldview and their way of doing things and not be imposing. And unfortunately, we often see the latter in the disability industry. And also, Samantha, thank you as well for sharing your insights. And I think there's going to be a lot of, a lot that people can sort of glean from the information that you guys have provided. We'll definitely put up a link to the resources that you guys suggested on our website, as well as recording of this webinar today as well. So was there any more questions that came through the chat for the ladies?
No, just lots of thanks for people, and thank you so much for attending today, and from all of you.
Yeah, agree. And thanks for First Peoples Disability Network for inviting us to come along and chat.
No worries. Thanks again, ladies, and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Drew. Take care.
Bye.